Intermediate rigging exam questions. The asymmetric sling angle formula, it's just upside down. The sling tension formula used for drifting a load between points is the same as underscore 100 pounds, 500/5 equals 100. If a load is 500 pounds and you have a block and tackle set up with 5 parts of line, how much effort is required to lift the load, the line that is being pulled on? What is the hauling line for a block and tackle? Explain, imagine, or physically practice this maneuver. Can you invert a load with 2 hoists? Written records of inspections and repairs. What kind of sling documentation should be maintained? Divide the sling length by the vertical distance between the upper and lower load-bearing points. How is the sling angle factor, SAF, calculated? The Crosby User's Guide for Lifting, the Crosby card. What resource is invaluable in rigging and permitted for use during the practical examination? A competent person. Who inspects all the slings daily, prior to use and during use? Explain, imagine, or physically practice this maneuver. Can you invert a load with 1 hoist? When a load needs to be raised or lowered over a relatively short distance. When are jacks used? They grip a wire rope and pull it horizontally. What are grip hoists used for? The distance between the load-bearing points at each end. How is sling length measured? 6:1 represents the minimum size of the load versus the sling width. Example, if the attachment point is 6 inches in diameter, the chain links cannot be larger than 1 inch across. What is the minimum D/D ratio for rigging with alloy metal chain? What does this ratio represent? 150 pounds, 150 pounds of line pull x 1.00 block factor equals 150 pounds. In this picture, how much force is on block number 3? 1,850 pounds, 2,500 x 0.74 equals 1,850. If a double choker hitch is rigged around rebar with a wire rope sling and the angle of the choke is 60 degrees, what is the rated capacity if the sling tag says it can hold 2,500 pounds for a standard choker? The asymmetrical bridle sling formula. What formula must be used for calculating bridle sling length tension for loads that have a center of gravity that is not located in the middle of the load? The equipment's operating temperature and manufacturer's guidelines regarding working temperatures. When working with hot loads, what should a rigger be aware of? Attached and legible sling tags. In order to use a sling, what must the sling have? Never. Always use blocking between the jack and the load. When is it acceptable to place the metal lifting plate of a jack directly on the metal surface of the lift point? At the beginning and the end of the drift. When drifting a load using 2 hoists, when they're the greatest chance of creating sling angles of less than 30 degrees. 290 pounds, 150 pounds of line pull x 1.93 block factor equals 290 pounds. In this picture, how much force is on block number 2? In a cool, dry place out of direct sunlight. Where should rigging components be stored? 150 pounds to lift it and the block has 300 pounds of pressure. Suppose you have a 150-pound load that needs to be lifted. If you use a pulley mounted to the ceiling and the other end is attached to the load, how much effort is required to lift it, and what is the total strain on the ceiling mount, assuming you're pulling straight down? As low as 1%. If you're pulling an item on rollers across the floor, using metal rollers on a smooth surface, what percent of the load's weight may be required for line pull? 25:1 represents the minimum size of the load versus the sling width. Example, if the attachment point is 25 inches in diameter, the wire rope cannot be larger than 1 inch across. What is the minimum D/D ratio for rigging with wire rope with mechanical splice socket type eyes? What does this ratio represent? 15:1 represents the minimum size of the load versus the sling width. Example, if the attachment point is 15 inches in diameter, the wire rope cannot be larger than 1 inch across. What is the minimum D/D ratio for rigging with wire rope with hand-tuck spliced eyes? What does this ratio represent? 10,000 pounds, 10,000 x 1.00 equals 10,000. If you wanted to use a metal mesh sling in a choker configuration, but the only information listed on the sling tag is 10,000 pounds in a vertical configuration, what is the rated capacity for a choker? 7,500 pounds minimum rated capacity, 1.5 x 5,000 equals 7,500. If you needed to use a jack to lift a 5,000 pound load, what is the minimum rating that should be on the jack? As a rule of thumb, 87%. How much is a sling's rated capacity reduced if a load is rigged with a choker hitch pulling at a 90-degree angle, when a qualified person deems it safe? When can sling angles of less than 30 degrees be used? The load applied to the block is often more than the line pull. If this increased tension isn't considered, the mounts or the block itself can fail. Why is understand block factors important? A brake is sometimes built into the block and tackle. Block and tackle can be used to lift loads without powered equipment. What device is sometimes used to prevent the load from falling once the hauling line is released? 8,000 pounds, 10,000 x 0.80 equals 8,000. If you wanted to use a polyester round sling in a choker configuration, but the only information listed on the sling tag is 10,000 pounds in a vertical configuration, what is the rated capacity for a choker? 3 feet. If you have a block and tackle set up with 3 parts of line, how much line must be pulled in order to raise the load 1 foot? 600 pounds of line pull. 1,000 x 0.60 equals 600. If you are dragging a wood pallet, loaded with 1,000 pounds across a concrete floor, how much effort is required assuming the coefficient of friction chart listed in the book is used? 8:1 represents the minimum size of the load versus the sling width. Example, if the attachment point is 8 inches in diameter, the synthetic rope cannot be larger than 1 inch across. What is the minimum D/D ratio for rigging with synthetic rope? What does this ratio represent? 150 pounds to 2 parts of line at the load. In this image, how much force is needed to lift the 300-pound weight? Never, they're for horizontal pulling only. When can grip hoists be used to lift loads? Never. When can a rigger use the crane to pull a sling out from under a load?